All right, so let's talk about how you go about starting your dissertation proposal and planning for your dissertation. For the record, this is for the undergraduate and postgraduate students in anatomy, and so that's where we'll be focused. And this is supposed to give you more of an overview, so I won't be going into specific details for many of these topics. Alright, so before you begin choosing a topic, there's a few things you should be aware of. One of them is that the topic you begin with isn't necessarily going to be the topic that will be on your final dissertation. So you'll probably be modifying it as you work on your proposal, and it will finally become more appropriate to the work that you've chosen to do. The other thing is that you can have more than one topics in mind when you're at the beginning of your planning stage, and you can finally narrow it down to one of the topic that you feel best suits what you want to do. So you can research a few topics and then finally decide to do one of them which you feel you can get it done the best. Another thing that you need to know is that you can either choose to do a practical project or you could choose to do a review project. A practical project is where you get your own data from the subjects or the experiment, whereas the review project is where you work with already published literature to form to give a sort of summarized opinion or extract data from them. Have a look at what could be done in practical projects. So suppose you decide to work with cadavers, you could be looking at gross anatomy, in which case you could be studying anatomical variations of arteries, nerves, or other anatomical structures. So for example, this study is looking at anatomical variations of the internal iliac artery. You could also be measuring dimensions and distances related to anatomical structures. For example, this study is looking at the dimensions of the sacral hiatus. You could, of course, also be measuring physical properties and other properties related to anatomical structures, and many a times this is the case with biomechanical studies. If you decide to work with histology-based projects, you could be looking at some of the tissue properties. Now, this could be physical properties such as tensile strength and elasticity. These could be biochemical properties such as the distribution of collagen, or you could be looking simply at the distribution of particular cells within a tissue, in which case you might have to do staining. You could also do a comparison between different regions of the tissue or between different tissues which are sort of similar. Another area to explore would be that of education in anatomy. And if you look at it from a teaching perspective, you could be looking at some of the newer tools and technologies to be used in teaching students. So, for example, you could be looking at 3D Atlas or the use of web-based learning tools or online question banks and how or if they help students, if they're more effective. The other thing in teaching domain could be what are the tools you could use to assess the students and how effective they are. So you could be looking at ASCIIs or multiple choice questions or short answer questions and trying to compare between them if any of them is better at analyzing the students' capacity. Or if you're looking at education from a learner's perspective, you could be looking at the obstacles encountered in learning anatomy, what makes it more difficult and what makes it easier. So you could simply be looking at if they're given recorded lectures versus they're attending real-time lectures, which of them is easier, or does interaction with teachers make it easier for them to learn anatomy. So you could also be looking at how they respond to particular things. So does role modeling or demonstrating a dissection help them do a better dissection, for example? So these are more broad areas. If you do research, you'll probably find more specific topics to do within these themes, and that's where you'll be focusing on really. One more theme in anatomy would be techniques involved in making cross-sections or making sections or simply embalming. So how these could be more effective or how to teach them, or for example, teal embalming preserves more lifelike properties. So you could be looking at if it preserves those properties in all regions of the body or on just some particular tissues, or how much it preserves them. Another thing would be working with living human volunteers. So in this case, it's usually dependent on what observations you can make from them. So for example, one of my friends worked with looking at the foot arch and measured the foot arch of students and other volunteers just to look at the predilection for flat foot among humans. You could also design some surveys to assess opinions regarding particular themes or topics. Uh, One last thing I would say is that these themes are not an all-inclusive, so there could be more themes related to anatomy in which you could do practical projects, and they're also not mutually exclusive. So you could actually design a project which incorporates more than one of these themes, and often you will have to, especially if you're working with education and doing a practical project, you probably need student volunteers. Okay, so why would you choose to do a practical project? Well, the simplest reason would be that you get to learn some practical skills. Now, this could have to do with dissection skills if you're doing a cadaver-based project. So you could be learning how to do more specific, more fine dissection of structures. You could be learning how to delineate those structures. Or if, for example, you're working with bones, you could be learning how to extract bones through dissection. Another thing could be that you learn how to use new tools and techniques which you don't normally get to use during your course. So, for example, if you're studying arteries and veins, you might be using silicon injection and you'd learn to use it, how to study arterial structures. You could be learning new machines such as the micro CT machine or the digitizer or more advanced machines to measure tissue properties. And these are skills which might help you in the future, especially if you're considering a career in research or in academics. So what you want to pursue in the future is definitely something you should keep in mind when you're deciding whether to do a practical project and what to do the practical project on. Okay, the other thing could be that this is your first time doing research and you want exposure on how to to use research tools and techniques and how to design an effective practical project, how to go about doing it. And the experience is going to teach you, like to do better practical projects in the future. This could also be the first time you get to use the statistics in research and you learn how to do statistical analysis to derive meaningful conclusions from your data. Also, for some of you who are already looking at PhD, your project might be what you want to expand upon in the future when you're doing a PhD. And in some cases, it might be easier to publish a practical project. So you might decide to work on a practical project simply because you want to publish and you think that it would be easier if you did a practical project. So why would you choose to avoid doing a practical project? It has a lot to do with time. So I cite that you'll probably get to learn a lot of new tools, techniques, and methods while doing your practical project. And all of these take time to learn how to do and how to do well because you need to get meaningful proper data from them. And that's something that you have to learn unless you already have experience with them. So there's a learning curve. And the other thing is that there's usually paperwork involved in doing practical project, and especially important if you're working with human volunteers or sensitive data such as patient data, and these things could take time. You just might not have enough time window to do a practical project. I'm talking this in context of undergraduate and postgraduate work in which you might not have that much of a window. If you have a window, these things start making sense. Also, if this is your first time doing a practical project, you should expect things to go wrong and to go wrong at different stages of your project because it's something that you're learning as usually on the initial stages and in the practical project because once you start learning to do things you start learning the limitations of what you are doing and how what you're doing might not exactly be what you were expecting to get out of it. That's why I said that you might need to redesign your proposal as well as modify your dissertation a little bit and how you go about it. Okay, the other thing limiting a practical project would be the access to proper tools and subjects. So if you, for example, you need a particular machine or a particular set of software to do your practical project and you just don't have access to it. So for example, the micro CT machine could be booked and you just don't get access to it within the time frame provided. So you'll have to avoid it. A third thing would be that you believe that what you're trying to do a project on already has had enough research done on it. So it might be more relevant to sort of collate that research and derive meaningful observations from the sum total of that research, in which case you would want to do a review project. So a review project utilizes published literature already present, and in doing this, you could either decide to do a narrative review, in which case it's a more relaxed structure. You could choose and pick your articles as you go along the review. So, say even when you're writing the review at a later stage, you find a couple of articles which you decide are very relevant to your review. So you could decide to include them later on, and you could change your review a little bit to adapt to them being included. On the other end, you have a systematic review, which is more rigid and a lot more structured. So in a systematic review by design, you have to specify how you'd be searching for the articles and what exact methods you'd be using and what exact places to search for those articles, what you'd be using to filter those articles, what are the criteria you'd be using to filter them. And so by design, it specifies which exact articles you'll be using. You won't be using articles outside of that once you have specified that design of the review. So a systematic review is more rigid, more structured, but it's also easier to replicate and thus more sound if you're looking at it from a scientific view. A third thing is a scope and review. The scope and review is also quite structured, but scope and review is usually done in areas in which I'd say research is more in inchoate stages. So there are areas of literature which are not very well defined at the current point of time, and they are being actively researched. So you want to do a scope and review to establish those areas more concretely and to define boundaries around this area, like what exactly comes under this area and what exactly has been discovered. You want to give a more concrete form to a sort of more abstract theme at the present time. A thing which is common to all review projects would be like strong critical analysis. So no matter which review you decide to do, you have to read deeply and you have to present like very sound logical opinions by using good critical analysis skills if you want your review to be sound. So why do you prefer doing a review project? Well, as I said, you could be of the opinion there's already plenty of research data present for the topic that you are interested in, and you'd rather analyze the existing published literature to derive meaningful observations rather than just add another set of data to it. Also, there are topics in which the opinion is more ambivalent or controversial. So there could be a set of research pointing towards one set of conclusions and other sets of research pointing to different sets of conclusions. And you want to work through the existing research and try to establish a more logical, coherent opinion for those topics and try to point towards a consensus on those topics. A third thing is that you've decided to do a practical project, but within time frame you can't get it done. So you decide to do a review project just to get a better sense of what has been done in the area, and you can later build your practical project by focusing on those areas which have not been done. So that's something you might consider. Also, you just might like writing long-winded opinions on the works of others. So who am I to judge? And yeah, you do get to learn skills while you're doing a review project. Those may not be practical skills, but you get to learn how to deal with large amounts of data, how to interpret the publication data on others, how to find like what makes the research data strong and more relevant as compared to other research data, how to analyze the methodology followed and dissect it and find like what is exactly what is that a set of researchers are doing better than another set of researchers. So you learn to assign importance, relevance, and to assess the soundness of scientific approach of others. And you also learn to work with large amounts of research data to interpret, analyze it, and to make conclusions out of them. So why might you not want to do a review project? So like I said, simply you might want to do a practical work. Or one more thing is that research or review projects tend to expand or later on in time, as opposed to practical projects where the most significant obstacles you'll be facing will more likely be in the initial half of the project, and then you're doing your data collection and learning how to use them. And this is for the people who are doing it for the first time, not people who are already well versed in how it's done. But whereas the review project, you start collecting articles, or you design and you collect articles and get it done uh, relatively quick. But once you start working through those articles, the review has a tendency to expand, and you might find yourself a bit short on what you could include in that. And this is quite more true for narrative review because, as I said, you could decide to choose and pick articles and include them later. So as you walk through more and more articles, you have a tendency to discover more and more relevant and good articles during the course of doing a narrative review, and you might be conflicted about including them. And if you do include them, it has a tendency to keep growing and becoming huge. So it limits your time and limits your scope. So if you don't have the time and the scope to do it, you might not want it. The thing that I've mentioned is that you need to have a thorough understanding of what you are doing a review article on. And this does not just include what the exact topic of your dissertation is, it includes adjacent relevant areas to it. So, for example, if you're working on the anatomy of a particular structure or anatomical variations of a structure, you need not just to know about that structure, you need to know about the relevant structures in its proximity, where it's located, what role that structure plays in human physiology, pathology, and clinical and surgical regions, and what would be the implications of its anatomical variation. This is something we'll talk about a little bit when we're discussing relevance later. But you need to read through a lot of articles, not just exactly focused on your topic, but also articles which talk about the relevance of your topic and talk about how your topic is related to some of the other research themes. So this adds a level of complexity to review, and especially systematic reviews, because you have to design a very structured approach. They also have another level of complexity, so you'll have to deal with them if you're designing a review. So how do you begin to choose a topic? Well, there's a few things that might help you in choosing a topic, and this would be familiarity, interest, relevance, scope, and time. So let's go look at them one by one. By familiarity, I don't mean that you have to be an expert on the topic that you're choosing, but it's good that you know a bit about it, a bit of background info, a bit of what it is. So because that helps you design a way to get to know it deeper. Like, for example, let's just say you're trying to do a study on the anatomical variations of the internal iliac artery. So in that case, it would be good if you have done the dissection of the pelvis and you know what the pelvic structures are, what the internal iliac artery is, what are its branches, and what's the course that it takes. So this knowledge will actually help you appreciate the actual research that has been done previously on it, and appreciate how you'd go about doing your own practical project. And it will make it easier for you to do your project. Alternatively, you could take your time learning about the topic, but this, as I said, this will take time. So whether or not you choose a topic that you're unfamiliar with should depend on how much of a time window you have to design a proposal and to do your actual research work. So let's talk about interest. By interest, I mean the topic of your choosing should be something that you're curious about, that you want to learn a bit more about, and that you like put in an effort and time into. So you should be a bit passionate about it. You should enjoy the process of working hard at it, and you should enjoy the results you get out of it. Because just to be honest, your dissertation is probably going to be a bit stressful for many of you, and there are times when you feel that you're not yourself, times when you feel that the world is restrictive, but if you have interest, you'll learn to pull through. So one of the first things to consider in relevance is whether or not the topic relates to the field that you're pursuing. So if you're doing an anatomy, it's probably not a good idea to do it about genetics and transcription factors, unless, for example, it has to do with embryology and or say neuroanatomy, and it ties deeply to the neuroanatomy of that particular structures. So just say whatever topic you're choosing, make it actually relate to your field. So if you're choosing a disease and you're just going to go about purely clinical uh, symptoms and signs of the disease, and how it is clinically assessed, what are the treatment options, and not talk about anatomy or anatomical implications at all, is probably not a good idea. So just make sure that what you're choosing is relevant, not just to the science, but also to your field. Okay, the other thing to consider is whether or not the topic of your choosing has previous research done on it. And this is most likely going to be the case because usually when you're doing it for the first time, uh, it's better to follow and build upon. And even most of the time, you have to follow and build upon what has already been done. So if it has been done, consider what's still in the theme or the topic that you're pursuing. So what are the most current areas of research, the most interesting, the most important things that are currently being investigated in that area. And that's where you should try to build your own topic. And I mean, that's ideally the place, whatever you choose, it would be better if it's somehow related to it. Also consider what's old and obsolete or has been rejected. So that's probably not a place where you should focus on your efforts on. You might also want to consider what has already been firmly established in the field, and doing further research on it wouldn't add much. So one of the things that gives context to this thing is that you should think about what you can add to what has been done. You're basically building up on what the existing body of scientific evidence is, and you're trying to add or perspective or to add new data to it. So that's why you're trying to consider what has been done. Of course, a third thing to consider with respect to relevance is whether or not you're following the instructions you've been provided. So, for example, if you've been told just to do a practical project, just don't do a review project. And if you've been told to focus in a certain area and that you're like not allowed to pursue some of the other areas because of some restrictions or whatever, I mean, just make sure that what the topic is in mind is something which is permitted and in accordance with the instructions you've been provided. So one way to think to ensure relevance is to read previous literature, as I've said. And you'll find things that are related to your topic, you'll find what's important things, and you review your topic in the light of those areas, in the light of previous research, and you discuss it with your supervisor and with other people you know who have active research interests or who have expertise in that area. Second thing to consider is the scope, and the scope would be decided by the word count or the page count that has been allotted to you, by the time and resource that has been allotted to you, and of course by the guidelines and instructions. The scope means that what specific area you'll be focusing on and how deep into it you'll be going. So let's say you're looking at the anatomical variations of the internal iliac artery, just the previous thing that I talked about. So the scope would mean that you could be looking at the entire internal iliac artery, or you could be looking at just the anterior division or the posterior division. You could be looking in just one of the sexes, male or female. So this is how you're sort of specifying what you're looking at, and you could be doing measurements on the internal iliac artery, what exactly how many measurements you take related to what structures you take. Decides how deep you're going into the topic. So you could be looking at other properties related to the internal iliac artery, and how many properties you look at and how deeply you investigate that as what would define the scope. And this should be decided based on how much time and resource you can dedicate to it, and how many words or pages you can write about it. Because if you choose something too large, you'll find it difficult. So again, reading through the previous literature, reviewing what you have in mind, and discussing it with your supervisor and your seniors will help you get an idea of how to decide the scope of your project. And it's also something that you'll likely be modifying in the process of making your proposal and working on your dissertation, because depending on what limitations you find out of what the tools and resources you have, you'll have to modify the scope to fit with what you have. So the most important thing that you need to consider is time. During the course of your dissertation, you should think about what things you'll be spending on time at. You're spending the time on. So in the beginning, you'll probably be spending time on researching through the previous literature and previous research on the topic. You'll also be spending the time on collecting data and learning the tools, especially in case of the practical project. In the review project, you'll probably be learning how to use software and how to go about searching for articles. Also, you'll be spending time on analyzing or interpreting the data and making sense of it. And of course, you'll be spending time on writing your dissertation, making a discussion, making a final draft of your dissertation. So these are things you'll be spending time on. Of course, during the course of your dissertation, time will also be spent on you'll have to manage your time on, especially if you're sharing the workspace or the tools or subjects that you'll be using with others. So for example, the category you're working on will probably also be needed to be worked on by other of your peers will also be working on the category if they're doing another practical project. And that's something you should consider. It's the same for the equipment that you'll be using. And you'll have to coordinate with your advisor, who will probably be advising other students, with the technicians and the technical staff and the lab that you'll be working at. And you might be having to coordinate with the library if you're doing a review project, so as to get access to full text articles. And in some cases, you might have to have a discussion with someone who is well versed in statistics. All of these things will take time, and this is something you should figure in. And then, of course, you will be spending time in getting access to the required tools, and this would involve filling in the paperwork in many cases and making a proper schedule. You'll require access to full text articles, to proper software for doing your research, and this might take some time. Of course, throughout the course of your research, you will be reading through published literature, and that is something which will take the most of your time. So let's talk about what exactly does researching through prior literature mean. Researching through prior literature is important because it will help you establish relevance, scope, decide the time period, and it will help you understand the methodology of practical projects, and it will help you revise and improvise your project when it runs into obstacles, or to refine it to make it better. Now, one of the simple ways to begin it is doing a simple web search, and this would give you some idea about what the topic is and what the research areas are. But a more specific and more fruitful thing to do would be to search through the academic search engines. Now, there's a lot of academic search engines such as PubMed, Scopus, Google Scholar, and some of these are paid, so you should look whether or not you have access to it, but a lot of them are free, and you can do a literature search through these search engines and find out what published literature already is on the topic that you're choosing. Another thing to look at would be the previous thesis. There are quite a few websites that I've listed here that you can use to look at the prior thesis. But most importantly, you should have a look at your own institution and library and look for what the previous batch of students has done. And that will give you a more accurate idea about what exactly it is that you require to do. And just to keep in mind, if you're looking through for the thesis online, a lot of these theses are PhD theses, so they are in a lot more depth and complexity than what you will be required to do, but they still can give you an idea about your research topic and how to go about doing it. So what exactly are you looking for when you're doing a academic search of the published literature? Well, as I said, you're looking for the most current and important areas of research which are currently in focus, and which is where most of the work is being done. So, for example, let's say you want to do something related to shoulder anatomy and to do a PubMed search. So you get quite a few articles. Some of them would be talking about the bursae. Some of them might be talking about ligaments. Some of them will be talking about shoulder, glenohumeral osteoarthritis. And once you read these articles, you identify more specific areas where they are focusing, and you begin to identify like what things are most relevant to this topic and at the present time. So if you are looking at a more of a summarized version of what those topics are, or a collation or sort of a condensed version of what various people have done in regards to their topic, so then you're looking at review articles. Whereas if you want to look at what exact data is being collected, what is the process being followed to collect the data, how people are measuring it, what exactly they're using instruments and techniques, and what are the statistical analysis used to verify those data and make sense of them, then you're looking more at the original research articles in that area. So identifying these areas will help you decide where to focus your dissertation on, and it will also help you identify what are the keywords and mesh terms related to the topic of your choosing. So, for example, let's look at the glenohumeral osteoarthritis title, and you'll see that there's a related keywords listed at the bottom of the abstract. You can use these keywords to refine your search and focus on the articles which have more to do with your research. And the same way you could use your mesh terms. Another thing that these articles provide are they sort of serve as a template for what you will be doing. So you could build your own practical project, the methodology and the way based on how other people before you have done. You will have to, of course, refine it or add something new to it, because you can't exactly be replicating the same thing unless you're trying to verify that it is replicable. So you, but you can learn a lot by seeing what they have done. So when you're making your own methodology, you can look at them. And even in the case of a review article, you can look at how other people have sifted through the data and how other people have made observations regarding the validity of the data and the importance, attach the importance to their scientific evidence. And you could design your own review article the same way. Of course, by sifting through the research, you also get to learn what you don't want to include. So let's say, for example, you wanted to do about the shoulder anatomy, and you read quite a few articles about osteoarthritis, but you're not interested in the osteoarthritis. You're interested plainly in the normal anatomy of the shoulder joint. So you just decide to exclude pathology. Similarly, you probably run across studies which have been done on animals or in a specific subset of humans or a specific subset of species, things which are not related to anatomy. So people could be doing 3D computer modeling. And so while it is related to anatomy, it's not something which is very relevant to your course. So these are the things which you would exclude when you're doing your own project, especially if you're doing a review. So when you've looked through these things, you will come to think of what's called a research gap. So this actually relates to what you can add to existing evidence. And in doing this, you have to consider what has not been done. What are the areas which have not yet been investigated or which could be potentially investigated to add more to what has already been done? Or you could consider what could be done differently. So um, let's say people have in the shoulder anatomy thing, let's say people have studied the osteoarthritis, and let's say for normal anatomy they've studied the glenoid cavity and the dimensions of the glenoid cavity, but you just want to study the dimensions of the capsule around the glenoid cavity, and that has not been studied. So that if for instance that has not been studied, you could do that. So you could add something which has not been done. Uh, and doing things differently, you can say, let's say one of the studies has just done a radiological analysis of things. So it has looked at the CT or MRI films or X-ray films and just measured things. And whereas you are going to do it through dissections, so you want to establish a more physical correlate of what has been measured on radiology. So you're doing things a little bit differently, and you can either try to establish that your method is more accurate, or you could just look at what the correlation between what you have measured and what was measured radiologically is. So it's just about adding something which has not been done, or adding or doing things a little differently. So that's how you add to what has been done. Right. Once you've identified this, you arrive at what is your research question, which is exactly what the intention of your research is. Like more specifically, well, this is going to relate to your topic, and this is going to relate to the research gap that you have identified. So once you have identified your research question, which I'd say it will take a bit of a back and forth between you, your supervisor, and the literature before you narrow it down to, okay, this is exactly what I want to do, and this is why it's important to do it. So just make sure after you have identified your research question that you have enough resources, enough ways to get what you want in order to do research on it. So let's say, for example, you're trying to do a review article, just make sure that you have plenty of articles to do it. Now, to be honest, you could do a review article even with 10 or 15 articles if you're going deep enough with it. But one of the ways is like if you're a bit more superficial, let's say that there should be around 30 or so articles if you're trying to do a review on it. And say you're trying to do a practical project on a cadaver, so just ensure that you have enough cadavers to make the data you have gathered valid. So if you're just going to do it on one or two cadavers, there's not going to be much significance to the data that you gather. Now let's talk about the actual design. The first thing you should keep in mind when you begin designing your proposal is that it's going to be a bit vague and you're going to make changes to it. So whatever you do decide on the topic or the ways how you'll be doing, you'll be making changes to it as you read through the literature, trying to make it more specific, more relevant. This is how you will define the scope to relevance and make it suit to whatever time and resources you've been provided. Now, one of the ways of refining the topic and reducing the scope is what I consider as a snowflake method. So let's say there's an area that you're interested in, say it's the nervous system. So you just look at what the components of the nervous system are. So let's say these are brain, spinal cord, autonomic nervous system, and your ventricles, and the meninges and peripheral nerves. So you decide to focus on one of these areas, you choose one of these areas. Again, in that area, there will be, so I say for autonomic nervous system, there's parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems. And each of these have their components, which then have their own components. So you keep subdividing a broader area into narrower and narrower topics. It's going to take a while, but let's say, for example, here you've chosen cranial nerves. The cranial nerves itself is a huge topic to work with. If you have a short dissertation, you could write several books on it. So you read up on cranial nerves, and then you identify what are the areas of research on cranial nerves currently. So you subdivide it into the areas of research. You choose one area of research and you subdivide it further. So you keep subdividing it until you reach a specific enough topic which is novel, which is relevant, and the scope for it is enough that you could do it within the time and resources provided. And let's say once you've decided you feel like there's not enough subjects or enough data available on it, you could include just the nearby topic just to increase the scope. So if it's too specific, you could broaden out by including the adjacent topics. And if it's not enough not specific enough, you just subdivide until you reach the right level of specificity. So the next part of designing your proposal is how to organize it. So I'll just present a template that could be useful in this case. So you begin with the working title, which identifies what you'll be doing. It gives an identification for what you'll be doing. So let's say that internal iliac artery, say the title could be identifying and analyzing the anatomical variations of internal iliac artery among humans, or on the human cadavers, teal embalmed human cadavers, if you're working with teal embalmed cadavers and you want to specify that in the title. You can come back to the title after you have decided and worked on the rest of your review. So while it is the first thing in the organization, it's not necessarily the first thing that you will write once you start writing your proposal. The next thing is the introduction and the background, which is where you'll spend the effort that you've spent reading through the literature will shine through here. So you'll discuss what makes your topic important. You'll establish the relevance of your topic, and you'll talk about what has been done on that topic previously, and why it's important to do. What is the importance of what has been done? What implications do the contemporary research have? And that you'll try to hint at what has not been done and try to identify that what could be done or done better or done in a different way. And that's how you will lead into your aims and objectives. So the aims and objectives will be more specific things that you will be doing with it. So you will be identifying anatomical variations. You will be making measurements related to it. So the aim and objective will try to sort of give specific areas that you will be focusing on during your research. And then one of the things is hypothesis. Now, the hypothesis would be a statement that would prove like whether or not what you intend to prove is true. So let's say you are looking at the anatomical variations of the internal iliac artery, and so one of the hypotheses could be that there is significant anatomical variation in the anatomical artery. So that would be one way. The other way is another thing you could be looking at is that there is significant variation between the right and the left side. So that would be the second hypothesis. The third hypothesis could be there is significant variation between the male and female. So each of these statements can be proven true or false, and they will in turn provide the answer to your research question. So this is how hypotheses are built. I mean, in each of these cases, this is important in a practical project that you establish what you're going to set out to prove at the end. So let's just discuss another example. For example, if you're looking at a web-based learning tools versus textbooks, your hypothesis could be that there is significant difference in the performance of student using a web-based learning tool as opposed to using textbooks for anatomy education. Or it could be that using a web-based learning tool provides a better results as compared to using textbooks when attempting OSCEs. So this is how you establish your hypothesis. They provide an answer to your research question, and whether they are proven or disproven is how they will provide an answer. And so that's what you'll set out to do. The other thing I want to talk about is, although I've said like you will be modifying your research bit by bit as you your proposal bit by bit, the thing to be aware of is that your hypothesis should be established before you begin your data collection. So you cannot collect your data or say in a review article, if you're doing a meta-analysis, you cannot collect your articles and then come back and modify your hypothesis, because that would be manipulating your data. So your data collection has to be done after you have established your hypothesis, and it is important to be specific with your hypothesis. In the last example, when I talked about, like, if you're talking about there is significant difference between the use of web-based learning tool and textbook in anatomy education, that's a different statement as compared to if you're saying there is significantly better performance when using a web-based learning tool as compared to textbooks. So in one of those cases, you're saying that these two will provide you a different result depending on their use. And in another, you are establishing that the web-based learning tool is superior. So you will be using different statistical tests, and you'll be going about your study differently depending on how you design the hypothesis. Yeah, so that's what I wanted to talk about, hypothesis. It's important to keep in mind. One thing I forgot to say about the hypothesis is that in some review articles, or in some cases when you're doing purely observational study, that means you're just looking at what is, and you're just trying to characterize what is already present. And let's say you're trying to characterize the histology of a tissue, what is there, what's not there. So in these cases, there may not need to be specific hypothesis statements. So just discuss with your supervisor if you need a specific hypothesis statement in the course of your study, and look at the previous studies that have been done, especially the previous thesis and dissertations that have been done. Okay, so let's come to the next part of the proposal. You have to write about what subjects you'll be using, or in case of the databases, it's good to specify, in case of the review article, it's good to specify what databases you'll be using, or academic search engines you'll be using. So, and in here, you have to be a little bit specific. It's good to be a little bit specific. So let's say you're going to be using categories. You should speak about how many categories you want to be using, and what part of the category you want to be using. And so it's good to be specific about it, because it helps you identify what you'll be working with, and it helps the institution identify what they need to provide you with it. So if you're vague, it will cause difficulties. And of course, you can refine this in the process of designing your proposal. And so in case of databases, you can identify if you'll be doing your search just on PubMed, or on PubMed and Scopus, or on PubMed, Scopus, and Google Scholar, and this sort of things, what articles you'll be using. Right. You need to define inclusion and exclusion criteria, like I said. So let's say for category-based projects, you need to say, I will be excluding anything which has gross pathology, or you could be excluding categories outside of a certain age group, or you could be excluding based on sex. Like I said, if you're trying to study particular female structures or male structures, you will have to exclude based on sex. So these cases, and so this way, in any cases, like if you're working with, say, medical education, and you want to assess the response to quizzes, you might want to exclude people who are in their fourth year or fifth year of medical school, because they have enough knowledge that just looking at the impact of a small tool would not change that much knowledge base, not have that much impact on the big knowledge base that they already have. So the way to go about it is to think about what exactly you're trying to do, and what things could interfere with it, and what things you don't want to investigate. Like I said, reading previous research always helps. And in case of review articles, I've already talked, you might want to exclude things with gross pathology if you're not looking at them, things that have been done in other species, things that are looking at it from a more physics perspective or computer-based perspective, and you won't talk about it. Right, methodology, I've already talked about that, looking at the previous research work and designing around it, trying to refine it, trying to make it better, especially for practical project. And for systematic reviews, you need to have a look at the PRISMA guidelines, and even for scoping reviews. So they have clear guidelines that you can follow to make good systematic reviews. For narrative review, the methodology isn't going to be that complicated. You just need to give a simple description about how you'll be going about searching your articles and what areas you'll be focusing on and what databases you'll be using, like I said. And the last thing would be statistical analysis. So if you're planning to do a statistical analysis, it's good to write about how you plan to analyze the data. Again, look at what previous research work has done to analyze that set of data. Talk to someone who's good with statistics. And statistical analysis is not necessarily necessary for reviews unless you're planning to do a meta-analysis. So once you're done with this, and you've made a draft of your proposal, I'd say discuss it again with your supervisor and seek help. So for example, in a lot of areas you can add to them and refine them. Let's say, for example, in methodology, you need to be relatively specific for practical projects. So once you're discussing with your supervisor and you're seeking help with from others who have done it, say from a PhD student, you will learn what exact techniques you need to use, what instruments you need to use, and you can write a more specific methodology, which is actually good. So you should try to write like what you want to do, and once you discuss it again, so you'll begin identifying areas which can be improved upon, and that will help you write a good proposal. So this one is specific advice for the University of Dundee CAHID students. So, and if you're seeking help, please don't be afraid to approach the faculty, your supervisor, or your seniors. Most of them are very frank and willing to help, so don't be afraid of putting forward your ideas and seeking advice. The dissertations done by the previous students are available in the department as hard copies, so please do go and have a look. And if you're having issues finding articles online or finding full text articles or finding books, please approach the library. They have a lot of resources and they have skilled people to help you out. And if you're facing issues in the process of writing your dissertation, please approach the Academic Skills Center. The other thing I would suggest is please plan ahead. So you should start ideally working on the background or literature review section even before you get the chance to start working on your practical projects or the real crux of your project, because your project actually the main part of your effort will start after your semester is finished, but you can start working on your background earlier than that, and this will help you give clarity about what you are doing, and will also help you with the latter half of your project, because you will understand how to improve it and how to write it. Okay, and the other thing that you need to know is that you will not be given a free approach to all the CADverse equipment and a lot of the things. There will be definite slots and which you will be provided. So just be very clear with your supervisors and with the department that what amount of time and what equipments can you be provided, because this is something which will have a drastic impact on whether or not you can submit your project in time. So try to have a clear timetable and try to discuss this with the department. Be very open, be very transparent, and be clear about what you want and whether or not you'll be given it within the time that you have. Also, if you're running into obstacles, whether it's early on or late during the course of your project, please document it and please maintain evidence of what issues you have been facing. Because if you do happen to have issues later on in time and your project runs into delays, you might have to approach the mitigating committee. So the mitigating circumstances committee is not your friend, and they will want like very clear, solid evidence if they are going to approve any of the delays to your project. So please ensure that you're documenting whatever issues you are facing, and if there are any delays arising which are not due to your fault, please ensure you have evidence for that, some sort of evidence. And in the same way, please try to understand the scope of your work. So I'm just saying this because some of the students tend to choose topics which are more generic. So you can't just go and choose, for example, the anterior compartment of the leg, or the heart, or the anomalies of the heart, or this sort of thing. So it's a huge topic, and there's lots and lots that you could write about topics which seem simpler. So that, as I said, you have to specify your topic, make it more complex so that your dissertation is more specific and the scope is just not too much. Because if you choose a very broad topic, you will run into lots of issues. And during your dissertation, you're expected to write deeply about the topic, to do deep critical analysis. And if you choose a broad topic, you don't have time or the word length to do that. The one last thing that you might have a doubt about is, if your practical project does not work out, can you change your review? So yes, that is possible, but there's a catch. And usually you need to have a really good valid reason for that. Often this has to be from things that were outside of your control, that were not your fault essentially. And you will need, as I said, evidence for this often. Sometimes your supervisor themselves might provide evidence, but in other cases you will need it. So one of the things that could happen in this case is that you can do a pilot study, which means that you can work with the limited data you got. I suppose you expected to work with 12 specimens or 25 specimens, and you could only do with 3 or 4 because you couldn't get the other specimens in time. So you can do a pilot study in which you're demonstrating the structure of your study and trying to establish that you would do a more full-fledged work later on when you get access to all the specimens. If this doesn't work out, then yes, you can request to shift to a review. But I would not recommend that because you're going to lose a lot of time and it's difficult to recover from that. It's going to be quite stressful. Yeah, so I'd like to acknowledge some of the people who really helped me through my dissertation, and because of whose influence, I was able to get this video done. So I just want you guys to learn from what I have learned from my seniors and my teachers. So thank you. Best of luck for your dissertation.